Hello and a warm welcome to yet another podcast on the Mission Shunya channel. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for coming back to listen to yet another episode. And if you are a new subscriber who's returning after listening to the previous episode on my personal journey in choosing an electric vehicle, a special welcome to you. We did have a lot of good feedback from the previous episode, and we will be back with more such personal stories going forward based on this feedback. Thank you for that. Now we are back to the feature theme in exploring something new as part of this global net zero transition. The recent commodity prices would have definitely caught your attention if you are in the sector. But even if you are a general consumer, you would have heard about the increasing prices, especially in the input cost, leading to an increase in overall prices of commodities and products. Well, in clean tech, the increase has been very significant. So, how is this trend likely to shape up in the near future? Well, I'm glad to introduce you to today's guest, who is an expert when it comes to critical metals for clean tech. So, our guest for today is.
Hi, my name is Taso Arima. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Iperionx. I am at Iperionx. We're looking at developing a low-cost, sustainable, and US supply chain of titanium metal and also rare earths.
Well, Taso, we know that for a long time in your career, most of it has been around commodities, mineral extraction, and you have done a lot of things in this space. But how did you get started with this? Do you have a background engineering or technical background in this, or was it just a pure business play?
Yeah, so for me, Girish, it started off, I grew up in Western Australia, although I live in South Florida in the United States today. As you can hear, I've got an Australian accent. I'm Greek by background, but grew up in Perth, Western Australia. So naturally, you have a lot of mineral focus in Western Australia, and I did study an engineering degree as well as a business degree. But I actually dropped out of university to start working in the finance space very early on.
Oh, that's interesting. So what was your first experience, or when was your first experience in kind of mineral extraction? Was it in Australia, or did you move out of Australia?
So I actually, when I dropped out, I was working for a merchant bank. We were financing early stage mineral extraction or mining ventures across Australia and Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And within a year of working at that merchant bank, and essentially I was working for the owner of the merchant bank, I had looked around the world and found a really interesting opportunity in the coal space. It was an undeveloped coal asset in Canada. And so I was financed by my mentor back then, and also some individuals in Western Australia, mm-hmm. to acquire that asset. And this was maybe in 2007. And over the 2007 through 2011 timeframe, we listed it on the Australian exchange. We then listed it on the TSX exchange. We raised close to $200 million, and we took it from a very small company to $1 billion company. So that was my first experience, and really got me into not just applying my technical skills, but really more applying a holistic approach to how do you build a company, how do you find the right asset, how do you build the right team, how do you raise the money. And then from there, I've just continued doing that. I had a few more coal development opportunities I built in Poland and in the US. But then I quickly moved into the space that you love as well, which is the commodity, raw materials, critical minerals space for advanced industries like electric vehicles, and clean energy focused as well. So I then founded a company called Piedmont Lithium. And so I've been doing this ever since. And now I'm working on the titanium supply chain.
Well, we generally talk about clean energy transition, saying shifting from coal to clean energy, but your story is also a shift in that regard, from coal mines to kind of going to cleaner energy systems. So that's really wonderful. It's good to know that perspective. And since you bring the techno-commercial perspective from a business side of things, I have to ask you this question, because in recent times, especially the last year or so, there has been a high turbulence in the commodities market, be it for especially for clean energy projects, be it electric vehicles, or even for that matter, other minerals required for clean energy products. So, what do you think the impact of war has on commodity prices?
So it's a good question. I think it's had a major impact on commodity prices. We have seen commodity prices substantially increase over the last few years as geopolitical tensions have increased, and especially on the back of the Russia-Ukraine situation, war out there. It's put a lot of pressure on those critical commodities, those critical minerals for the clean energy thematic, like nickel, like titanium, that has pushed those up as well. So I think it has put increased focus on finding geopolitically safe assets that can be developed to meet the mineral needs for our, clean energy sector, for the energy revolution we're going through, where we're going from fossil fuels to the electrification of everything and using batteries and renewable energy.
But from your experience, do you think that will be a possibility? Because from what I understand, I mean, the rare earth metals are really required for this transition, and they are not present everywhere. So, how do you think this transition will happen in a sustainable way, if we were to put it that way?
It's a great question. So, if you look at Russia, if you look at China, for instance, they don't exactly, in the case of rare earths, China does have a lot of rare earths in the ground in their country. But in the case of lithium, for instance, where I'm intimately familiar, they don't exactly have the control. They have the control of the lithium supplies, but they don't have it in the ground. What they've built is the midstream, the processing capacity to take the ores, whether it be from Western Australia, where I come from, or South America, and convert those into the chemicals needed for then going into the batteries. It's the same in titanium. Russia actually doesn't have any major titanium mineral operations, but they're the second largest titanium metal provider globally because they have the second largest processing capacity of titanium mineral to metal. So I think it's possible. You do bring up a point, but that you need to have the ore in the ground and you need to have secure sources of ore. But we see in the US here there to be an abundance of some of those key critical minerals, like we do titanium. There's an abundance of titanium minerals. There is an abundance of rare earth minerals here. There is an abundance of lithium resources here. And then in other Western countries, there's also an abundance of potential resources out there. And I think the governments like the US government here, is working to reassure that and incentivize the build out of not just the mines, so to speak, but also the processing capacity. But it will take time and it is challenging. And building anything is challenging. Building a coal mine is challenging. Building these supply chains is going to be challenging. But just because it's challenging doesn't mean we shouldn't try and do it.
That is true. You need a lot of support, especially from the governments, to set this up and keep it rolling. Now, your current business focuses around titanium, but you started with lithium as well. So, talking about lithium, and you did it in a time when EV booms were just picking up. So, what kind of incentives did you get to kind of set up this business going? Do you think the market demand was increasing, and was that a convincing factor, or did you see other incentives to set the business up?
It's a good question. So my incentive to get into the lithium space was driven by my time in coal. So I was living in Western Australia, but I was developing coal projects in Canada, Europe, and the US. And once I moved to the United States in and around 2015, I realized that there was a clean energy revolution going on, and I wanted to be part of it. And importantly, there was coal-fired power generation customers that were talking about themselves, these companies, these power generating companies were talking about going into renewables. So my incentive was I wanted to spend my time working to support the development of these clean energy supply chains that I needed. So it started with lithium. I could see that lithium was going to be. I was actually looking at lithium more for lithium storage for like solar and wind,
Okay.
because back then the electric vehicles weren't that big, but you could see that electric vehicles were coming, and so that was really the incentive there, that you could see that the market was going to be there.
That's interesting. Now, talking about the other rare earth metals, what is the general market for these apart from the clean energy or automobile space? What are the other big markets where you see business, especially, say, considering titanium? Where are the other big markets for these?
Yeah, so titanium is separate to the rare earth metals. For me, the rare earth metals, the demand drivers. There's some historic markets in ceramics and other applications, but the main demand and consumer electronics in rare earth metals. But the main demand driver for me in the rare earth metals are the permanent magnets that need to go in the electric vehicle motors or any small electric or any small motors. So I see that being the huge demand driver there. But switching to titanium metal, I see there being huge demand in the traditional sectors, consumer, the aerospace, defense, medical. But if we can lower the cost of titanium metal, there's huge demand in areas like the automotive, the electric vehicle space for lightweighting because it's 45% lighter than steel. I think there's huge opportunities if you produce a low cost but also sustainable source of titanium metal to use it in a lot of applications where you see steel and aluminum being used today.
Exactly. Now, the first thing that comes to your mind when you talk about titanium is the price point, and it's globally expensive, and that is probably the reason why it's not easily adopted in spite of being comparatively better. Now, in the process that you're setting up, what are the probabilities that you're seeing in terms of cost reduction, and what percentages are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we have so we're a public company, so I can't talk as freely as I would be able to if we were private. We have to, abide by the market rules. But we have publicly announced that we see in certain cases cost reductions of titanium products or titanium powders or titanium products by up to 75%. So at that point, that's a huge reduction. You start, and again, it depends, Girish, on the application. But in certain like you're not going to ever, I don't think we'll ever wrap a can of Coke in titanium cans rather than aluminum cans. But look, if you look at things like in consumer electronics, where there's a lot of aluminum used today, could we replace that with a sustainable and equivalent cost titanium product where it's going to be stronger, it's going to be just as light, and it's going to last longer and be more corrosion resistant? So I see over the next 5 years, 10 years, that level of cost reduction coming with, and that's what I hope for with our company and our technology.
That's interesting. And since you mentioned that you can't disclose a lot of information, but on a high level, what is the major USP in the process? Because the key differential in your company, Iperionx, is kind of bringing titanium metal production to the American shores. And you claim to be doing it in an environmentally responsible way. So what is the big USP in this value chain?
Okay, the key differentiator. So the key differentiator is a completely different process that's based on a scientific breakthrough that Dr. Zach Fong, who invented this process that is patented, that we're scaling up, where the traditional titanium metal manufacturing process from either scrap or titanium minerals uses a very carbon-intensive, energy-intensive, and toxic process called the Kroll process to take titanium minerals and produce titanium metal. Very costly as well. Our process is based on a scientific breakthrough which Dr. Zach Fung had less than 10 years ago in 2016. He was funded by the Department of Energy to scale this process from bench scale through to pilot scale, which we are operating at today. And essentially it's the technology is called hydrogen-assisted millilothermic reduction. It removes the need for any carbon It substantially reduces the energy needs. It allows you to process either titanium scrap or titanium mineral, and we are the only company in the world today which can manufacture 100% recycled titanium metal powder for, say, 3D printing industry or to make parts out of.
Interesting.
And in addition to that, it just substantially reduces that cost and complexity.
Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting to know that you have a patented technology that you're bringing to the table and that reduces the cost. Now, what are the big markets? What are the first few markets that you're immediately targeting in the next few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I said, we produce a sustainable source of titanium metal, even more sustainably than, say, stainless steel and aluminum can be produced. We hope to produce something that is cost equivalent or close to cost equivalent. And we also are looking to produce from a 100% recycled product. All those advantages, the major consumer-facing companies, like in the automotive space, in consumer electronics space, in consumer luxury goods space, all those companies are chasing these types of advantages in their material supply chain. So those are the industries we're going after first, the consumer-facing industries, where we can displace stainless steel, aluminum with a low-cost, sustainable, and 100% recycled titanium metal. And that's like automotive, it's like consumer goods, it's things like that.
Talking of this, I mean, I am not sure about where the geographies are, where the mass production of titanium happens, but sustainable production, the other angle to it is also the angle of ethical sourcing, since you mentioned about recycling and closing the loop so that the circular economy is preserved. So how much of importance is this also to the value chain?
I think it's of huge importance. We will eventually be producing titanium metal from ore in the ground in the United States. We have a large titanium mineral large titanium mineral resource we own and we're developing. But initially, our titanium metal today is produced from 100% scrap. And that is hugely important to a lot of companies, but it's also hugely important to us. There is a lot of scrap in the titanium industry. Only 65% of it, from our calculations, is recycled. 35% is either downcycled in the steel industry or goes into landfill. And so I think in an effort to reduce the reliance on extracted minerals, we need to maximize the recyclability of our materials. And so I think that's a major competitive advantage of what we're bringing to the table, is to not just create an ethical supply chain from the ore in the ground through to metal, but to create a completely, to close the loop, to create a circular supply chain of titanium metal products as well.
Well, actually, that's interesting. Considering the price point of titanium, it's surprising to know that nearly 35% is invariantly sent to landfills. Yeah, any particular reason? Is it because is it too hard to identify the value of the metal in the system that we currently have?
So prior to our process being developed, there's a subset of the titanium metal scrap market, which that scrap is very hard to reprocess or recycle. And even though it's a very high value product and you don't want to waste it, unfortunately, because of certain characteristics of that scrap, which prior to our processing technology, you just could not recycle it, even though the price was high. It just didn't make any economic sense. So for us, that's a key advantage. We can come in and we hope in all cases, but in a lot of cases we've seen thus far, we're able to recycle that material, actually upcycle it from just scrap to high value titanium metal powders, which can be used in the 3D printing industry, for instance.
Well, Taso, that's a really valuable point that you brought into the discussion, because I didn't know, probably maybe a lot of other listeners also wouldn't have paid attention to this, that the technology for recycling titanium was not very convenient or was not very easily available, and that is the reason probably one of the costliest metal is what's actually not properly valued. So that's interesting, and that's really a big differentiator that you're bringing to this industry. Now, before I move on to my final question about a different sector, now you did mention that most of your manufacturing and most of your setup is now in the US. With this kind of opportunity in the global markets and the patents that you have in the space, especially on the recycling front, I'm sure you would have also thought about it from a global viewpoint. So, what are your global aspirations in the years to come?
So it's a really good question. I've thought about it very at a high level. We will scale this technology over the next few years in the United States. We're a US company. We want to reshore US manufacturing supply chains and be an instigator of reshoring major US advanced manufacturing supply chains like 3D printing industry. But we also will look at, in the future, expanding offshore. There's opportunities for, as you say, recycling. There's a lot of titanium metal which needs to be recycled in Europe, for instance. Europe has a large aerospace sector as well with Airbus there. There's opportunities there. There's a large automotive sector there where we could potentially, and a large consumer luxury goods sector there, for instance, where we could take aerospace scrap, recycle that scrap into titanium metal powders and print parts for the aerospace or the luxury goods sector, like the luxury watch sector, for instance. But then looking further past that, there is opportunities, I think, we will stick with countries that are allies or friendly in relations to the United States, because we are a US company and we are patriotic to the US. But we will look to expand and try and bring an age of titanium to the world.
Well, that's good to know, and I'm sure a lot of countries are probably more friendly to US as well, so they'll be definitely welcoming this move. Taso, now on a final note, I'll have to ask you this question because it's a favorite part of the question when I talk to an expert like you from this sector, because there's a lot of discussion that goes on in the space about the availability of raw materials, especially say lithium and other precious commodities, rare earth materials. Now, for say scaling up the clean tech transition, be it energy or electric vehicles, do you think there is enough content, enough minerals available for all this transition that we want to foresee in the future?
So I do believe it's there. Again, it's some are more challenging than others. At current prices of where I see rare earths and lithium, there's a lot of incentive for non-traditional sources to be developed. For instance, in the lithium market, you have traditionally had spodumene, hard rock resources, be converted into lithium, and brine resources in South America into lithium. But at these sort of lithium prices, there's incentive there to look at these non-traditional sources, the geothermal brines, the lithium clays. Now, there's going to be challenges in the first ones that build those operations. And there's always going to be challenges like that when you're the first one that is doing something that's never done before. But that does not mean we shouldn't try it. And I think there will be success over the longer term in developing the non-traditional sources to feed our needs. There's not many minerals I can think of where it's not available in the ground, and without going through a few years of challenging development, we couldn't get to having enough for our clean energy transition.
Well, that is really a fair point. The early movers are probably going to be spending a lot more of time, energy, and money to get the systems in place. And hopefully by then, this ecosystem is supporting enough to kind of ensure that all players thrive. What are your final thoughts on how the commodity prices will shape up in the next few quarters, if I were to ask you?
I think commodity prices with the geopolitical tensions currently are going to remain at their historical highs. I do see some supply coming online over the next 3 to 5 years, but still there is huge transition going on. So I think the years of relatively low pricing, which we saw, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, with say lithium and nickel and rare earths are gone, I think there's going to be a new normal. Whether it's at these levels, maybe not, maybe. But I do believe that these historic highs are going to be more of a new.
Well, the shocking part of the entire story is that most of the projections and forecast, be it in the renewable energy space or electric vehicles, were all dependent on this downward trajectory that was forecast a decade ago. That prices of all these commodities would go down, and so we can expect more of the uptake in the sector. But from what I hear from you and what is generally kind of visible in the market is that the prices are going to stabilize at a new normal, as you put it. So that is really scary, and I hope it doesn't be very high compared to what was in say early 2022.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point. The battery materials in general need to come down, and the battery cost, needs to come down, and it has a lot. And only recently it's come up because of pricing of commodities being high. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't know if these ultra high prices will last, but I don't think the prices of say $7,000 a ton lithium hydroxide is ever coming back again. But could it be $20,000 a ton and not whatever it was, 70,000 it peaked at, or 30 or 40,000? Yes, it could be. But what needs to continue to happen, and is happening, is continued advancement in bringing the cost of the battery or the energy density down. And that happens by, improving chemistry, as you see with Tesla doing a lot of improvements to the battery, increasing energy density. But in our respect, like what we're trying to do with our Iperionx, if we can substitute stainless steel or steel in the battery box, for instance, with a lighter alternative, which is titanium, that's 45% lighter, then that helps improve the energy density of these batteries as well. So I think, yes, it does not help the cause if prices are ultra high, but I think there will be a new normal which is far higher than what it was historically. But there needs to be that continued progress on advancement in the technologies for the battery space and the electric vehicle space.
Well, that's a really wonderful point to kind of end the conversation, Taso, because as you say, although the prices are not in the control at this moment, but what is definitely under control is the trajectory for product development, the roadmap for improving efficiency of the system and things around that. And as long as companies work on that, I'm sure overall the systems will be better. So
I completely agree.
Well, Taso, it's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, honestly, this is not the subject area of expertise, but this subtopic and is definitely of interest because of the recent trends in the commodity markets and the uncertainty about where we are headed. So to get this perspective from an industry veteran like you was really useful. So thank you very much for taking time to join me on the podcast today.
Absolutely no problem. It was a real pleasure as well for me. Thank you, Girish.
And that was a wrap on yet another insightful conversation on the Mission Shunya podcast. Lithium, titanium, and all the crucial minerals that will play a major role in the clean tech transition are very important. Couple of points to reflect upon. First, recycling of crucial metals is still poor and there is scope for improvement. Second, sustainable and ethical extraction is key if we have to ensure that the net zero transition is equitable. There again, there is plenty of room for improvement. Finally, while the prices are on the rise, let's hope the work being done by the companies in improving the efficiencies and the processes continue to ensure that the long-term impact is minimum. So let me know what you think of this. MissionShunya@gmail.com is the ID. You can also tag Mission Shunya across Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. The handle is @MissionShunya. The links to connect with Taso will be in the show notes section of this episode, so please check them. While you are there, you should also check TerraGeneration.com, our friends who are creating the beautiful artworks you see in the episodes. Terra Generation is a content agency specialized in telling stories of people and organizations working in climate, biodiversity conservation, and sustainability. I will be back in 2 weeks' time with yet another insightful conversation. Until then, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off, and as always, thank you for listening.